President Trump is fed up with the fentanyl crisis. Now he's ready to take the fight straight into Mexico, with drone strikes targeting the cartels. But there's one big problem: Mexico didn't approve. And if Trump moves forward, it could blow up one of America's longest-standing alliances. So how real is this plan? Could it actually stop the cartels? Or is the US about to cross a line that changes everything? This is the US plan to strike the cartels. Let's break it down. On April 8th, NBC News reported that the Trump administration has started planning to launch a bombardment of drone assaults on the Mexican cartels. The outlet spoke to 6 law enforcement officials who collectively stated that the goal is to combat the cartels and their trafficking across the border the US shares with Mexico. These plans aren't set in stone yet. They're still in the early stages, with discussions ongoing between officials from the White House, the Defense Department, and the intelligence officials who'll be responsible for finding targets. However, we do know that the US is thinking about several ways to use its drones, including conducting targeted strikes against high-ranking cartel leaders and damaging the logistical networks the cartels use to ship drugs into the United States. The source also said that the discussions are ongoing about exactly how the US will conduct these strikes. It could work alongside Mexico, assuming Trump's team is willing to open talks over US military action taking place across the border. But, says one official, unilateral covert action without Mexico's consent is also on the table, meaning the US could send drones without permission to take out cartel leaders without the Mexican government even knowing about it. If that's what Trump decides, the move would be unprecedented, says NBC. This is not only in terms of the number of US military personnel his administration dedicates to the task, but also in terms of using unmanned aerial vehicles to attack enemies on an ally's territory in the first place. The most interesting thing here is that there are already US drones flying over Mexico. They're in the skies to conduct reconnaissance. However, those drones are there with the Mexican government's permission, with one former official stating they're looking to build a target deck. In other words, the drones flying over Mexico are finding key points to strike. Future drones may be loaded with explosives. That brings us to our first question. Why is the US thinking about launching drone strikes against the cartels? In a word, fentanyl. The dangerous drug has been the lever Trump has used to rally against Mexico since he took office. On his inauguration day, he claimed that Mexican drug cartels are killing 250 to 300,000 American people per year. White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt has built on those claims since, claiming that action against Mexico's cartels is needed because fentanyl has killed tens of millions of Americans. NPC says both of these claims are false. USA Facts backs that statement, noting that the number is closer to 250,000 Americans who've died due to the drug between 2018 and September 2023. However, it also notes that fentanyl deaths have been rising during that period. In 2018, the number of annual deaths stood at 31,335. By 2022, it had more than doubled, reaching 73,654. NPR adds that the American fentanyl crisis was also improving before Trump took office. Since June 2023, deaths due to the drug have fallen by 21%, dropping below 90,000 deaths per year. The fentanyl problem may not be as big as the Trump administration makes it out to be, but it's certainly an issue, and it's one that Trump has focused on both before and since he became the US president. It's also one of the chief reasons Trump used for his decision to apply tariffs to Mexico. On February 1st, the US announced a 25% additional tariff on Mexico, claiming that the move was intended to hold the country accountable for the flow of fentanyl. Those tariffs have been paused and restarted since, but Trump's message is clear: clean up the fentanyl problem or the US will take action. The planned drone strikes against the cartels are just the next step in America's plan if the tariffs don't work. There's also the issue of how much fentanyl reaches the US from Mexico. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, Mexico is indeed the main source of the drug in the United States. It claims that almost every scrap of the 21,900 pounds of the drug that US law enforcement seized in 2024 originated in Mexico, with only 43 pounds coming from Canada, another nation onto which Trump has imposed tariffs to combat the fentanyl issue. That doesn't account for the fentanyl that slips through law enforcement's hands and makes its way into the US. And it's the fact that so much of the drug slips through that is the problem. CFR points out that the cartel's shipping methods vary massively, meaning there's no singular smuggling point on which the US can focus. In 2024, fentanyl was seized across the entire border the US shares with Mexico. Seizures were made in San Diego, Tucson, Yuma, El Paso, Del Rio, Laredo, and the Rio Grande Valley, to name just a few, meaning the US has essentially created a front-line border force to deal with the problem. Now Trump wants to expand that solution to the point where he's striking against what he sees as the root cause of the fentanyl issue. It seems that he's chosen drones as his method of tackling the cartels. And that leads us to a question. What does Mexico think about all of this? When news emerged of the US drone plans, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum was quick to decry the efforts. In a news conference held on April 8th, she said, "We reject any form of intervention or interference. That's been clear. Mexico coordinates and collaborates, but does not subordinate itself. There is no interference, nor will there be." In other words, Mexico won't accept the US planning to use drones to hit the cartels on its sovereign soil. Such an act might even be considered an invasion of its territory. Sheinbaum also believes that targeted drone strikes simply won't do enough to solve the problem. While the idea hasn't been formally proposed, we've made it clear that it wouldn't address the root of the issue. What truly works is ongoing attention to root causes. Arrests driven by intelligence and investigation, coordination, and zero tolerance for impunity. "We categorically reject any such actions," she adds, referring to the drone plans, "and we don't believe they will happen." Trump may not agree. As NBC points out, he's made several comments in the past, suggesting that all cards are on the table when it comes to dealing with the fentanyl issue. He also appears to have suggested the idea of striking the cartels on Mexican territory with US weapons before. That's according to Mark Esper, who served as Trump's defense secretary during his first stint as president. In his memoir published after his service, Esper claimed that Trump asked him in 2020 whether the military could simply fire missiles into Mexico to decimate the drug labs the cartels use to create their product. More worryingly, from the Mexican perspective, Trump asked that question while also quizzing whether it would be possible to conduct these types of strikes while denying any US involvement. It's worth noting that Trump has rejected Esper's claims, claiming that he never asked these questions. However, assuming Esper's account is true, it brings another interesting consideration into play. The US doesn't have the authority to conduct any form of military action in Mexico. The International Crisis Group made this clear in a February 2025 article. It noted that the Trump administration's designation of several cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs, seems to be laying the groundwork for the US to conduct military strikes against them. After all, the Trump administration reclassified the Houthis, which is a militant group believed to be an Iranian proxy, as an FTO on January 22, 2025. Less than 2 months later, the US launched an intensive airstrike campaign against the group that is ongoing as we create this video. So the US has precedence in using the FTO designation to justify attacks on foreign soil. The problem, according to Crisis Group, such a use of force, absent a change of circumstances, would be hard to square with domestic or international law. It argues that the US president is looking to repurpose the War on Terror handbook by using designations designed to justify America's past interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan to launch attacks against an ally. Granted, those attacks would target the cartels, which that ally also wants to eradicate, but Trump would be setting a dangerous precedent. What would stop him from identifying any group he wishes to hit in any other country as an FTO so he can launch airstrikes and drone assaults in the future? The Crisis Group's claims of illegality appear to be backed by Colby Jenkins. Currently serving as the Assistant Defense Secretary for Special Operations, Jenkins told a Senate committee that Trump's designations of several cartels as FTOs doesn't automatically give the US military the authority to strike against those groups. The designation helps us unlock the doors to coming up with solutions for the cartel problem, Jenkins told the Senate. But it's not enough to make drone strikes against the cartels legal without some involvement from the Mexican government. That brings us to another interesting question. What would happen if the US government followed through on its drone strike plans? The Spokesman Review says that any such strike would probably cross a red line and could trigger a sharp deterioration in US-Mexico relations. That crossing of a red line would have massive ramifications, possibly leading to Mexico doing less to battle the cartel issue on its own soil as a response. Cooperation between its law enforcement groups and the US could plummet, not only on the fentanyl issue, but on other problems Trump has highlighted, such as immigration from Mexico. Professor of Government at Cornell University Gustavo A. Flores Macias backs this view. Unilateral US airstrikes on Mexican soil would be devastating for bilateral relations and could be detrimental to the objective of fighting drug cartels. The Mexican government would face tremendous domestic pressure to respond in the strongest possible terms, including severing diplomatic relations with the US and collapsing binational cooperation on migration and security, among other topics. In other words, the US would risk losing one of its closest allies. It's also worth noting that it seems unlikely that drone strikes, at least against cartel labs, would work, and that Mexico has stepped up its own campaign against the cartels under Sheinbaum. The Spokesman Review says that the strikes may produce the kinetic optics that President Trump favors, They would also allow him to point to a specific action the US is taking to solve the problem, much as he's doing with the airstrikes against the Houthis. However, Mexico's cartels aren't stationary targets. They're highly atomized operations that often produce clandestine drugs in primitive laboratories that can be easily replaced. So even a successful drone strike against one of these labs doesn't mean much if the cartel targeted can just create a new lab. Plus, those lab strikes would only kill low-paid workers who aren't involved in the cartel's main operations, making them practically useless, beyond causing some short-term pain for Mexico's drug gangs. Sheinbaum has also proven herself a far better ally on the cartel front than Trump may want to admit. Under her leadership, Mexico has stepped up its actions against the country's organized crime groups. The country has shipped 29 cartel leaders to the US to face trial since she took office in October 2024. That amounts to a rate of nearly 5 cartel leaders captured per month, with Sheinbaum seemingly favoring the approach of cutting off the cartel's heads to devastate their operations. Trump has even praised this work, calling Sheinbaum a marvelous woman for what she's doing. However, that hasn't changed his rhetoric around how the US needs to wage war against Mexico's cartels. Perhaps that rhetoric explains why the US is now planning to launch drone strikes against the groups. Sheinbaum's work often slips under the general US radar. It's certainly not work for which Trump can take credit. As the Spokesman review suggests, Trump may be looking at these planned strikes as a way to create kinetic proof that he's dealing with the cartel issue. If that's the case, he might have the support of the American people at least. Back in September 2023, Reuters published the results of a poll that suggested Americans broadly supported the idea of conducting military strikes in Mexico. That 7-day poll found that 52% of Americans support sending US military personnel to Mexico to fight against drug cartels. Only 26% said they didn't support the action, with the rest claiming to be unsure. The poll also revealed a clear division across party lines on the issue. On the Democrat side, 47% said they opposed the use of the US military to tackle the cartels, with 44% claiming to support it. Republicans were far more fervent in their approval, with 64% saying they'd be happy to see the US military take it to the cartels. That would seem to clear the way for Trump's strikes, were it not for one issue. Most Americans don't want to see the US take unilateral action against the cartel. Only 29% of those surveyed supported the US going it alone. Even on the Republican side, which Trump represents, only 40% supported unilateral action versus 51% who opposed it. So though Trump may have some support from the American people for taking a militaristic approach to Mexico's cartels, his idea to conduct drone strikes against the groups without Mexican cooperation is shaky. Which leads us to another question. Could the US and Mexico work together on these drone strikes? It's a possibility. After all, most of the action that the US takes against the cartels is done with the support of the Mexican government already. In December 2008, the two countries signed the first letter of agreement for the Merida Initiative. That signing opened a chapter of historic cooperation and acknowledging the shared responsibilities of the United States and Mexico to counter drug-fueled violence threatening citizens on both sides of the border, according to the US Embassy in Mexico. That agreement includes 4 pillars under which the US supports Mexico financially and through the provision of law enforcement resources to tackle the cartels. There's also Joint Task Force Alpha, or the JTFA, to consider. Created in 2021, the JTFA serves broadly the same purposes as the Merida Initiative, and is yet another example of how the US currently works with Mexico to suppress the cartel problem. We also have the previously mentioned work done by Sheinbaum's administration to consider. Almost 30 cartel leaders being delivered to the US in around 6 months is no small deal, and it shows that Mexico is taking the drug gang issues seriously. Granted, these cooperative efforts haven't always been as strong as they could be. However, they demonstrate that the Trump administration may not need to carry out its drone attacks against the cartels in a clandestine manner. With the appropriate negotiations, Trump could ally himself with Mexico's leadership to create a joint task force that allows him to conduct the kinetic action he seems to crave without angering a US ally more than he already has with his tariffs. Trump could also use those tariffs as a carrot on the end of a stick for Mexico. Allow the US to conduct its drone strikes, Trump could say, and it will remove the tariffs entirely. Perhaps that's the US administration's endgame with these drone plans. And if it is, we have an idea of how this sort of enhanced military cooperation might unfold between the US and Mexico thanks to the Atlantic Council. It says that such action would lead to the US and Mexico taking 4 key steps to both make the drone strikes possible and ensure they get the desired results. Building relationships and undergoing training is the first of those steps. The US military would have to establish operational partnerships with equivalent branches of the Mexican military to coordinate its drone assaults. This step might be the hardest, the Atlantic Council says, because of how deeply intertwined the cartels are with some of Mexico's law enforcement and military authorities. The two countries would also have to overcome the tensions already caused by Trump's 25% tariffs. However, assuming that the first step is carried out, the US and Mexico could move on to identifying their first cartel targets. Both already seem to be doing that. The US drones currently flying over Mexico, with the country's permission, are conducting reconnaissance on cartel labs and leadership. Mexico clearly has some sort of surveillance going on, which is why Scheinbaum has been able to capture so many cartel leaders in such a short period. The biggest task the two could face during this step may be identifying which cartel to tackle first. The Sinaloa cartel might be an obvious choice, along with the Jalisco cartel. Both have been identified as leading suppliers of fentanyl to the US. Claiming the scalps of the leaders of those groups would be an early affirmation that Trump's drone strikes are working. As for step 3, it's simple. With the targets acquired, the US could work with Mexico to send hordes of drones to attack cartel labs and leadership. This assumes cooperation not only with Mexico, but the relevant legal bodies in the US. We're already seeing what a campaign like this might look like, with the US strikes against the Houthis. However, those conducted in Mexico would have to be more controlled. The Mexican government wouldn't approve any drone strike that places civilians at risk, which creates a sticking point. If cartel members use their ability to blend into Mexico's civilian population to their advantage, the US might struggle to carry out this campaign. But even then, the fact that the US is forcing cartel leaders into hiding could be seen as a win. It wouldn't offer the kinetic results Trump appears to want, but it would slow down the flow of fentanyl into the US by disrupting cartel operations. As for the final step, the US would likely use the aftermath of its shock and awe drone campaign to force the cartels into negotiations and concessions. This step would be carried out predominantly by Mexico's authorities, claims the Atlantic Council. There's already precedence for this step. In February, the Mexican government managed to broker a ceasefire between the Metros and Grupo Escorpion cartels that saw both agree to end their infighting and halt the flow of fentanyl into the US. More concessions like those might be the result the US covets most from its drone strikes. Still, so much of this is speculative at the time of creating this video. Right now, we know that the US is planning on conducting drone strikes against Mexico's cartels. The key question is whether it will do so alongside Mexico, or if Trump will risk destroying America's relationship with Mexico by conducting the strikes unilaterally. What do you think the US approach will be? Are we going to see American drones taking out cartel leaders in the future? Is this type of military campaign enough to stop the cartels in their tracks? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more commentary on the latest developments in the US war against Mexico's cartel. Now go and check out Mexican Cartel Island gets raided by Texas Rangers, or click this other video instead.